Melissa and I have been out on the road the last couple weeks looking into some ancient America stuff.
It rises and falls. Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Now am I in your shot?
Yes, now you're in my shot.
Some really interesting, very fascinating stuff.
It's on this bluff. It runs along the side of this bluff.
We'll come out of that in the due course of time.
Why is it called that?
And as we were sort of traveling through the Midwest and then through Oklahoma, we ended up stopping in Ponca City, obviously named for the tribe.
It says keep Ponca City beautiful with a backdrop of this weird boarded up building. And then in the rear view, you can see their $5 million mommy statue.
And as we drove through it, it became apparent that the whole city's identity has been associated with the oil boom that happened in the early 1900s, late 1800s, tied to some well-known oil guys. The one guy's got a mansion there, I think it's Conoco, and they later merged with the other oil giants. And
the Giant's Gate with his initials on it.
And they put up the statues in town about the progress of, settlers. And there's a big statue pretty much in the center of town, which sits on several steps of a pyramid. And on that pyramid is 33 feet tall. And it's a statue to the pioneering woman, and more specifically to the mother of this oil baron guy. So it's all kind of about him and about that.
Because he's the boy. So it really is about him. He's like, Mommy, I just want to go exploit land from the Native Americans so I can build a $5 million statue to you in the future. Mommy.
And then on the edge of town, we ran into a museum oriented towards the Ponca people and their struggle, and specifically to Standing Bear.
Standing Bear Parkway. This is a memorial highway for the armed forces.
So we ended up stopping and filming, and as it turns out, that statue is 22 feet tall. Just by itself, not on a pyramid. So read there what you will. At any rate, there's a pretty big issue surrounding Standing Bear and his whole legacy, which we walked around the grounds and went into the museum and found out about. And that is, prove you're a person.
May I ask you a personal question?
Of course.
Where do you stand on all this?
It's basically the most Kafka-esque scenario ever. If you think about it, and in thinking, exercise your own consciousness, it is positively absurd. It's uncanny, totally unsettling. Prove you're a person. But that is exactly what Chief Standing Bear was asked to do.
It's not difficult to explain.
I know, I've heard it all before. Surely you don't expect us to adjust our policies to meet your approval?
Standing Bear was a chief. More specifically, he was one of the sub-chiefs of the Ponca tribe at the time of forcible removal from their homelands outside or near Omaha, Nebraska, I guess specifically on the Niobrara River. And so he was an integral part of a situation that ensued that in turn would trigger one of the most significant court cases in American history. And despite the fact that the Ponca tribe played the game and did things the way the U.S. government basically suggested and expected and told people that's what they expected. And they had an entirely peaceful existence. They never went to war with the U.S. government, as many tribes did. They adopted an entirely agricultural lifestyle. And despite all this behavior and basically compliance, they were treated very harshly in their removal and subsequent relocation in and around the year 1877. And so the removal of the Poncas was prompted by what history has termed a mistake. A mistake that they gave their treaty-bound lands that were designated back in 1817 to the Teton Sioux, who were basically one of their rivals. So the Teton Sioux formed a treaty around 1868 with the U.S. government that basically led to the loss to the Poncas losing their land. And supposedly they accidentally stripped out the Ponca land and gave it to the Sioux in the treaty, and then they couldn't take it back or whatever. I'm not entirely clear on all the details of the whole thing, but it would have been overwhelming for the Ponca people of the time, for any of these people. This whole period would have been, it was just very difficult, right? So the idea of two or more units, tribes, localities, whatever, pitted against each other, with rival tribes competing for land or having one overwrite the rights of the other. It's definitely been a reoccurring theme. And if you haven't seen it, you should see the Sean Connery film, The Man Who Would Be King, for more on that whole idea.
Sean Connery and Michael Caine as they try to capture a whole country, a scheme for rascals to become royalty in the long-lost land of Alexander the Great. Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King.
That takes place over in like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India territory back in the classic days of British colonialism.
We're not little men, so we're going away to be kings. Kings of Kafiristan. It's a place of warring tribes, which is to say, a land of opportunity for such as we, who know how to train men and lead them into battle.
We'll say to any chief we can find, do you want to vanquish your foes? Of course, he'll say, go to it. We'll fight for him, make him king, then we'll subvert that king. We'll seize his royal throne and loot the country 4 ways from Sunday.
How's that for a plan?
But they're really able to figure out rivals and play them off one another for the larger gain of the British Empire. Anyway, and so the disputed lands between the Ponca and the Sioux just allowed for the pretext of the larger pressures that were behind the whole thing. And it was being brought to bear one way or another. And that's, in hindsight, it's a little bit easier to see the larger picture and how a sort of long game might have been played out, even though there are particulars in this circumstance. At any rate, if among the whites a man purchased a piece of land and another came upon it, you would drive him off. Let the Sioux keep from our lands, and there will be peace. Keokuk, the Sauk and Fox chief. Suppose a white man should come to me and say, Joseph, I like your horses and I want to buy them. And I say to him, no, my horses suit me and I will not sell them. Then he goes to my neighbor and says to him, Joseph has some good horses. I want to buy them, but he refuses to sell. My neighbor answers, pay me the money and I will sell you Joseph's horses. The white man returns to me and says, Joseph, I have bought your horses and you must let me have them. If we sold our lands to the government, this is the way they were bought. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. And this incident was really just one of many in a longer train of pressures for tribes broadly in the Nebraska and Kansas territories and everywhere else to sell their land for white settlement, particularly in the case of Nebraska and Kansas from the 1850s on when the Nebraska-Kansas Act brought a new wave of white settlers and westward development and all the things that came with it.
Basically everything about this statue is aligned with the dates of this Cherokee land run, Cherokee land strip, taking of the land thing. Not just the statue, but the museum behind it. Everything about it is tied to a monument to that. A monument to colonialism, a monument to taking things that weren't theirs. It's just really weird to be that proud of theft. I don't know.
Those who know what I know what I'm saying. Those who don't know won't know. Not from me.
So the removal of the Ponca people, when that time came, was overall, quote, grossly mishandled, in the words of the Oklahoma Historical Society. Consent of the several Ponca chiefs was not properly obtained. The detrimental timing and conditions of their walk to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma and certain parts of Kansas all proved to be a sad redo of the earlier Trail of Tears that had brought the tribes of the Southeast, the Deep South, to Oklahoma, and it was now being recast, in this case, with members of the Ponca tribe. Standing Bear was quoted as saying, "If a white man had land and someone should swindle him, that man would try to get it back, and you would not blame him." Accounts in the documentary that we got from the museum tell of women and children thrown into wagons, pulled by their hair, separated from all their belongings, taken out of their homes, left without all their resources.
Men sapped of spirit, supplies running short, food pots and grain jars.
And then the entire population forced to march southward for what proved to be a period of just over 2 months.
Men get meshed in it. Women, children, all dragged ashore and beached in harsh bondage.
And all during strangely inclement weather, with no basic protections and not enough to eat and all that sort of thing.
First, unbearable cold. Snow blowing off Ida. Blizzards killing bird flocks frozen in flight. Then heat.
So many people in the tribe were suffering from hunger, disease, exhaustion, and among these was Standing Bear's own daughter, Prairie Flower, who died during this process of exodus.
He tries to grasp her. She slips through his fingers, shadowing off down the flyways of sleep.
This is the anguish of the country's chief household.
It doesn't stop there, though.
After her arrival in Oklahoma, approximately a third of the tribe had died due to starvation, disease, and other related complications. The tribe arrived too late in the year to plant crops. They had been promised farming tools and resources, maybe food stores, but these were not provided, or hardly anything was, if anything. And so their agricultural assistance was lacking that had been offered and extended by the U.S. government. And they were basically just kept in this place, probably just to see who would survive in one sense.
When the clan messengers arrived shedding tears to announce to his blood clan what they've been dreading, the rout of their armies, a mountainous death toll, with anguish for all in the rolls of the fallen.
Any way you slice it, they were rendered uncared for in the place that they were driven to, that they were not asked but told they would have to move to. Basically, no one in the tribe wanted to go there, and then when they got there, there wasn't anything for them. And that seems to be a commonality for many of these tribes. You have driven me from the east to this place, and I've been here 2,000 years or more. My friends, if you took me away from this land, it would be very hard for me. I wish to die in this land. I wish to be an old man here. I've not wished to give even a part of it to the Great Father. Though he would give me $1 million or more, I would not give to him this land. When people want to slaughter cattle, they drive them along until they get them to a corral, and then they slaughter them. So it was with us. My children have been exterminated. My brother has been killed. And so it was during this second devastating phase of removal, when they arrived to a place that had nothing, that Standing Bear's second child, Bear Shield, his favorite son, died in January 1879. He was only 12 years old. And of course, plenty of other people died, but that was his son. And in dramatic fashion, setting the stage for both history and epic legend, his son Bear Shield made a solemn request on his deathbed to be buried in the valley of their homeland on the Niobrara River back in Nebraska.
The hope that I'd make it back home here to die and find rest in the earth I most cherish.
And this grief-stricken father, watching the death of two of his children, and in many ways the entire life that he had known, acquiesced to a promise that was both incredibly human and classic of the very archetypes repeated over and over in drama and literary culture by European types. I mean, it's just classic, right?
How can we mourn you? How give a voice to bereavement and love loss?
As they were, so ye are. Even as ye pile your dead brothers' bodies on them to make yet more dust.
I mourn for you. I sing a dirge for the dead.
That's why our child isn't here now in Argos. Our child. No more tears to squeeze out. Eyes bleary with weeping and sleepless night vigils, hoping the
Indeed, it is no wonder that amid so many griefs your suffering is double to lament and to endure.
What is there left for me to see or love?
Why, these tears, these eyes saw Troy leveled, and those who destroyed her doomed also to die. Now it's for me to die.
So Standing Bear and a band of about 30 others from his tribe left the reservation, defying their occupation, taking on personal risk to make the long trek back to Nebraska, still basically with no resources, to make the long trek back to Nebraska with the remains of his son, which they transported in a coffin, to honor the wishes of the dead in a most solemn and human way. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. Martin Luther King Jr. The funeral procession reached the Omaha Reservation on about March 4th, 1879, where they stayed with tribal friends, which they considered relatives among the Omaha people there. It was really close to where their reservation had been. But only a short while after they arrived, they stayed for several weeks and everything. Standing Bear and his group were arrested for leaving the reservation by one Brigadier General George Crook, who was kind of a veteran Indian war fighter. And he did so under orders from the Secretary of the Interior and Director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a guy named Carl Schurz. You might as well expect the rivers to run backward, as that any man who was born a free man should be contented when penned up and denied liberty to go where he pleases. I've asked some of the great white chiefs where they get their authority to say that the Indian shall stay in one place while he sees the white men going where they please. They cannot tell me. Let me be a free man to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. Chief Joseph. However, Brigadier General George Crook had a long relationship with several Native American tribes, and had fought against many of them on behalf of the U.S. Army. It appears in hindsight and in the view of history that his view of his duty, of the policies towards and against Native Americans, and his larger role had somehow evolved. Perhaps the scales had finally been removed from his eyes. Who knows? The false narrative that had allowed such cold and inhumane treatment seemed to have worn down. And Crook, perhaps because he became more conscious of what he was doing, appears that he may have been coordinating some kind of double agenda for social justice in playing out the arrest of Standing Bear, because it would trigger certain conditions that would have substance in the coming court case. Crook experienced a metamorphosis during the Sioux Wars and the trial of Standing Bear. He started looking at the indigenous people from his heart. Sympathetic to the Ponca and the tribulations that had endured, Brigadier General Crook delayed their return to their reservation in Oklahoma, instead quartering them and detaining them in Fort Omaha, a military facility, while they recuperated, rested, and also initiated the legal process that was to ensue. Meanwhile, on March 30th, Brigadier General Crook, who had arrested Standing Bear and his group, went in secret to the office of Thomas Tibbles, assistant editor at the Omaha Daily Herald, and pleaded with him to take on the story and help Standing Bear and all of the Ponca people, providing him with crucial details about the dynamics of the entire situation. Tibbles had made a name for himself decades earlier as a civil rights advocate and had cut his teeth in the abolitionist movement, joining the Free State Militia in the 1850s and even serving in the company of John Brown during the Bleeding Kansas mini-Civil War that preceded the larger official protracted U.S. Civil War. But by the point of the 1870s, even as unseen forces were moving to close the frontier, much of Tibbles' work had shifted into Native American advocacy issues. Thomas Tibbles had ties to the Omaha tribe, close relatives of the Ponca, and he took up the issue, bringing news about the injustices to the general public. His coverage sparked outrage and garnered public support, and soon after drew prominent quasi-celebrity attorneys named John L. Webster, who was from the Omaha area, as well as Andrew Jackson Poppleton, who was the general attorney for the Union Pacific Railroad, both of whom would take up the case pro bono. And it would also be the most notable case that either of those attorneys worked on. Representing Standing Bear, they filed a writ of habeas corpus claiming that the Ponca chief was entitled to equal protection under the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in the wake of the Civil War. After all, Standing Bear and his fellow travelers had been arrested for leaving the confines of the reservation and not for violating any law. The price paid for keeping a promise to his dead son who longed to be buried in their homeland, a solemn promise worth any price to Chief Standing Bear, any price that might have to be paid. Thus, the Standing Bear case versus Crook, essentially against the U.S. government of 1879, was on. As summaries of the trial give account, the U.S. government attorney G.M. Lambertson claimed that Standing Bear did not have entitlement to habeas corpus protections, expressing that as an Indian he was neither a, quote, person nor a, quote, citizen under the definitions of American law, and thus Standing Bear, in the eyes of this attorney, was unable to bring suit against the government in the first place. Basically, no rights at all, no pretense of it. At least he said it, instead of cloaking it behind a bunch of meaningless jargon and obscuring the argument. At least he just straight said, this man is not a person. This member of this Native American tribe is not a person. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. I mean, that's the point we're at in a court of supposedly civilized people who supposedly started a new country with equal rights for all, etc., etc. As the two-day trial drew to a close and Judge Dundee moved to rise from the bench, Standing Bear's attorneys asked for permission for Standing Bear to make an unprecedented speech. After all, an individual so contentious in his existence as to not even hold personhood could hardly be expected to actually utter words. At any rate, in dramatic fashion, Standing Bear spoke in his native language and was translated by Suzette Bright Eyes LaFleche, born to Omaha people, who was essentially part of the social set of abolitionists and early civil rights activists. And speaking directly to the judge, Standing Bear thus made an eloquent plea, rising and pointing at his own hand. His statement, translated in English, reads, "That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you also feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be the same color as yours. I am a man. God made us both." And as we went through the museum there in Ponca City, I saw this laid out in an exhibit. It was all in a room with portraits and everything and quotes. And I read basically the summary of the whole account. And I was overcome with emotions. When I read this quote, it was moving. It was definitely moving. And it's one of those essential statements that is essentially true. You sense the inherent truth of it, and realize that it's worthy of respect, and that it just reverberates through everything as being so common sense true that it's undeniable. And however complex the larger issue is, all the painful history and all the unsettled parts of this issue, this broader issue which seems to never be fully resolved, it remains at the heart of the matter that individuals should be respected and their position as human beings should be acknowledged and not denied. And they should be treated in a society as such, even one that's gravitating so forcefully towards centralized control now here in our lifetimes, and really depersonifying people, taking away their individuality and individual freedoms and their own identity. Even in that system, we really cannot forget the underlying humanity of everyone. Whatever you might think of different people, outside of your immediate community and comfort zone, this country, in spite of its purported ideals, it just remains trapped in this unresolvable conflict that is all wrapped up in unsettled business, even though it's so clear we're all just human beings worthy of basic respect. Anyway, I guess I'm getting kind of sentimental about it, but I hope you understand what I mean. At any rate, this speech about piercing his hand and feeling the same pain and having the same blood apparently also moved Judge Dundee, or it at least made him painfully aware and more self-conscious of the inherent contradictions of the principles this nation claims to espouse and to be striving towards. As the Encyclopedia of the Great Plains summarizes, quote, "In May, Judge Dundee delivered his extraordinary ruling that habeas corpus safeguards applied to Standing Bear, even though, as a Native American, he was a non-citizen, and in spite of the fact that for all practical purposes, he had renounced his Ponca tribal affiliation. Moreover, because federal statutes authorized the Army to deliver prisoners only to civil authorities, making the Ponca detainment at Fort Omaha illegal, Dundee ordered Standing Bear and the Poncas released." So, in short, the decision was victorious for Standing Bear, as much as victory can come out of any courtroom, and his, quote, personhood and thus his equal protection under the law was officially recognized. And subsequent appeals by the government attorney were rejected by the higher courts, so it stood. Part of Judge Elmer Dundee, who was United States District Judge for the District of Nebraska's decision, the pullout quote, if you will, read in part, quote, "An Indian is a person within the meaning of the laws of the United States." And so this decision upheld the idea, however controversial, that Native Americans are, quote, persons within the meaning of the law and thus hold the rights of citizenship. People are people. It doesn't mean you have to like them or agree with their way of life or the things they value, but inherent rights are looming over everyone and afforded to all. The hypocrisies on this are not fortified by truth. It's going to fall. It's not a good argument, those who pretended anything different. It boggles my mind to think how anyone thought this way, but it's pretty evident that this kind of thinking was in play. At any rate, here we are kind of on the brink of at least some progress. Judge Dundee noted in his decision also that he had consulted, the dictionary, and wrote in his decision, quote, "Webster's describes a person as a living soul, a conscious being, a moral agent, especially a living human being, man, woman, or child, an individual of the human race. This is comprehensive enough, it would seem, to include even an Indian." Really? Even an Indian. Anyway, that was the writing of the time. Please excuse the sarcasm attached with thinking early white settlers were somehow mental children at the idea that this step in our sordid history was ever even necessary. Judge Dundee also said when he gave the ruling that, quote, "Indians possess the inherent right of expatriation as well as the more fortunate white race, and have the inalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so long as they obey the laws and do not trespass on forbidden ground," end quote. Wait, who was trespassing on forbidden ground? Never mind. ethnicity and tribe began by definition where sovereignty and taxes ended. The ethnic zone was feared and stigmatized by state rhetoric, precisely because it was beyond its grasp and therefore an example of defiance and an ever-present temptation to those who might wish to evade the state." End quote. James C. Scott, The Art of Not Being Governed, An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. In the aftermath of the trial, Chief Standing Bear was caught in an apparent paradox. His recognition as a, quote, person worthy of legal protections under the United States Constitution was upheld, but apparently only if he lived outside the reservation. But it's one step closer, some have argued. At this time, tribal members on the res remained legally distinct from citizens in the United States, with respect to rights and privileges, and thus the freedoms hardly felt fully by anyone inside the reservation. In practicality, this meant that an American Indian had to submit to society and pursue one degree or another of assimilation. And this was the approach apparently favored by at least some in this community. One of them was Bright Eyes, Susan LaFleche, and really during this process ended up becoming a love interest and then the future second wife to Thomas Tibbles, the reporter. So some people were actually pushing for assimilation into white society, but not everybody. For many Native Americans, however, this would prove detrimental to their identity, their personal sovereignty, and yes, their personhood. To say the least, the issues of assimilation remain highly controversial, even now, but nevertheless, the aspects of assimilation are ever present, even as the law of recognition has evolved and the world has, quote, progressed. Quote, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." Ralph Waldo Emerson. It wasn't until 1924 that Native Americans became U.S. citizens by birth, and even today, things still aren't all that well sorted out. Though you were unlikely to have ever learned about Standing Bear's plight in your history class, he was a highly publicized figure at the time, representative of this issue, and rightly an early American icon of the civil rights movement and the civil disobedience tradition. Indeed, transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were very influential to thinking of this time, along with various high society abolitionist types and whatnot. Afterwards, Standing Bear was very much a representation and icon of this form of progress, and in as much as the court case had bearing, he was victorious, but at the same time, he was essentially cut off from his own people and was kind of left to blend in with society, where he was treated like a celebrity. He was wined and dined in expensive hotels and all that, but he wasn't living the life that he had originally intended to live. But there was definitely a dilemma in the legal status that he had to fight for in the first place. In the end, after all these things that had gone down, after an epic fight, classic of very human drama, Standing Bear proved he was a person and ultimately did get land back in what he considered to be the homeland of his heart, the place where he would bury his son, and he got to live out his final years there. He did at least get some allotment of land, more or less in the place where he wanted to actually live. Whether the Dawes Act itself and other, quote, reforms were actually a step forward or somewhat of a step forward combined with 2 steps back and all that sort of thing, it's up for debate. But regardless, Standing Bear's legacy definitely deserves to be remembered and placed along with other famous voices of the civil rights struggles for independence, freedom, sovereignty, and respect. Standing Bear should have his name right alongside Gandhi and MLK and all the others. From my youth, I was very inspired by the civil rights movement, and particularly the civil disobedience movement, put into words by Henry David Thoreau and the whole spirit behind that. I think it is essential that if we're going to stand up for the type of rights expressed in the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and stand for that kind of principle in our life and as citizens of this country, we have to stand up for other people who are marginalized, might be different from us. Maybe we don't agree with certain people, but they are still people. So I'm going to include a few of those quotes now. And yeah, I sifted through a bunch of those quote websites with the endless positive sounding quotes, but I try to choose deliberately, carefully, and verify what I could that, the person actually said it and who they were, the context of things. But let's be a little bit more honest here about quotes. It is the spirit of the quote in speaking to the heart of the matter that's most important here, much less so than who actually said it. Plus, a lot of things are essentially adages repeated by various people over time, borrowed from people in history, repeated by celebrities, and then attributed to them sometimes. So while it is important to try to be true and accurate on quotes when statements are in quotation marks, let's keep in mind the fuller context of what the quote really means when we're speaking about something.
Suffering comes first, then after awareness.
A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government, and what no government should refuse or rest on inference. Thomas Jefferson. Among the natural rights of the colonist are these: first, a right to life; secondly, to liberty; and thirdly, to property, together with the right to defend them in the best manner they can. Samuel Adams. All, too, will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Thomas Jefferson. No man is above the law, and no man is below it. Teddy Roosevelt. The civility of no race can be perfect whilst another race is degraded. It is a doctrine alike of the oldest and of the newest philosophy, that man is one, and that you cannot injure another member without a sympathetic injury to all the members. Ralph Waldo Emerson. A people who extend civil liberties only to preferred groups start down the path either to dictatorship of the right or of the left. William O. Douglas, Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, 1939-75. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves. Transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau, author of Waldo and Civil Disobedience. I dream of a better tomorrow, where chickens can cross the road and not be questioned about their motives. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Every oak tree started out as a couple of nuts who stood their ground. Henry David Thoreau. Give to every human being every right that you claim for yourself. Robert Greene Ingersoll. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Nelson Mandela. From the equality of rights springs identity of our highest interest. You cannot subvert your neighbor's rights without striking a dangerous blow at your own. Carl Schurz. Union Army general in the U.S. Civil War, German revolutionary from 1848 to 49, founder of the Liberal Republican Party circa 1872, and one-time Secretary of the Interior and head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time of Standing Bear's arrest. The whole of the Bill of Rights is a declaration of the right of the people at large or considered as individuals. It establishes some rights of the individual as unalienable, and which consequently no majority has a right to deprive them of. Albert Gallatin. You can't rise as a class. You have to rise individually. It's what many of the civil rights era people don't understand. Alphonso Jackson, 13th Secretary of HUD. This applied directly to Standing Bear's situation, no? There is one God, and he made both Indians and white men. We were all made out of the dust of the earth. Why should we fear to be crushed by savage elements? We, who are made up of the same elements. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Fate, in the Conduct of Life, 1860. God never does anything wrong. He knows what is best for me. No man can understand God or know why he deals with us as he does. Standing Bear. Our petitions to the Great Father were unheeded. We thought it better to die fighting or regain our old homes than to perish of sickness. Cheyenne Chief Dull Knife, who along with Little Wolf led a determined resistance in 1878 through 1879. The protection of the Bill of Rights available to all other Americans have not been available for American Indians. Not only have the federal courts studiously avoided considering the application of these protections, but Congress and the executive branch have frequently acted as if there were no limitation whatsoever in their power to deal with Indians, and the courts have deferred to this assertion of naked authority. Vinay Deloria Jr. The question is not if we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. The nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? Henry David Thoreau in his essay on civil disobedience, 1849. They cannot take away our self-respect if we do not give it to them. Mahatma Gandhi. 300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot be expected to find a voice in a whisper. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let us put it generally. If a regime is immoral, its subjects are free from all obligations to it. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago. Must the citizen, even for a moment or in the least degree, resign his conscience then? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. Henry David Thoreau in his Civil Disobedience essay, 1849. It is not always the same thing to be a good man and a good citizen. Mahatma Gandhi. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr.